Jason Hart from Media Detractors, Ohio. My favorite story of the week I saw on his website, so you might want to check it out. I think it's ohio.mediatrackers.org.
My name is Jason Hart, as Joe said. I'm the Communications Director for Media Trackers Ohio. Media Trackers is a very small, conservative nonprofit. We're running in 5 different states currently. About 2 years ago, Media Trackers launched in Wisconsin with a focus on the recall elections, everything surrounding Act 10 union reform law in Wisconsin. And they had a lot to do over the course of that first year. They had recall elections for a number of the state senators. They had a recall election for Governor Walker to cover. They had a very political campaign to essentially try and find anything illegal that anyone connected to Governor Walker had done in hopes of getting him thrown out of office effectively. And that investigation actually just came to a conclusion in the past couple of weeks. And so after that first year of Media Trackers, really kind of moving the ball and countering the left-wing narrative in Wisconsin, they spun off into 4 other states. We're now, in addition to Wisconsin, operating in Montana, Colorado, Florida, and then obviously here in Ohio. As of today, Media Trackers Ohio is just me and then reporter Jesse Hathaway. I've lived in Ohio my entire life. I have a management information systems degree from Miami. I was actually a web developer at the Ohio State University for 4 years before I got a phone call last spring asking if I would like to run Media Trackers here in the state. I did a lot of freelance writing in my spare time. I did a lot of work covering issue 2, Senate Bill 5, contributed to Breitbart.com, wrote some stuff for Red State, and apparently a couple of people liked it well enough that they decided to offer me a job. So we've been here for almost a year now. I think it was late April when we launched last year, and so we basically, like I said, are a very small shop focused on covering politics and media across the entire state and doing what we can to bring a little bit of perspective. It's not going to be news to anybody in this room that the left-wing narrative is completely dominant in all of the traditional media outlets across the state, whether it's the Plain Dealer, the Columbus Dispatch, the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Dayton Daily News, the Toledo Blade, especially the Akron Beacon Journal, or any of the broadcast news channels across the state. So we're realistic about what we can and cannot do. We can't cover everything that's going on at the state level, let alone everything that's going on at the state level and at the local level all across Ohio. There's 11.5 million people in the state. There's a lot going on. So what we do is try and strategically choose a few topics and really cover those in depth, bring some perspective to those issues that is either absent because the media completely ignore it or totally skewed because the media cover it from a very specific mindset. Media Trackers is open and honest about the fact that we are conservative. The top of every page on our website notes that we are a conservative, nonpartisan nonprofit. If anybody has any doubts about the fact that we're nonpartisan, I would invite you to read anything that I've written in the last month and a half about Governor Casey's proposal to expand Medicaid eligibility in the state. We don't really take sides based on Republican or Democrat. We are purely concerned about the principle behind an issue. We're not going to be right all the time because we're human, but we try and approach things honestly and bring some facts and bring our own perspective to all of the topics that we feel are the most important in the state. There's one local issue that Joe mentioned that I actually printed out an email that I hope will be a little bit entertaining. I didn't stand in front of a mirror and practice this in depth earlier today because I really don't get nervous about public speaking unless I try and put a lot of thought into it, and then if I practice and try and run through things, I rapidly spiral into a panic. So I just kind of threw together some slides, and I'm going to talk in a high level about several of the big issues that I think are the most important, that I think are instructive about the work that Media Trackers does, that hopefully you'll all be interested in. The first of those issues is PolitiFact Ohio. Has everybody in the room heard of PolitiFact Ohio? Are you familiar with them? They're actually a project of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and you don't hear much about them on a day-to-day basis like now in 2013. But PolitiFact Ohio was relatively widely cited by the news outlets across the state in 2012. And if you read the work that PolitiFact Ohio does, you'll notice all of that research, all of the fact checks that PolitiFact Ohio does are written by reporters for The Plain Dealer. The Plain Dealer is in Cleveland. Cleveland is a kind of liberal big city, and The Plain Dealer is kind of a ridiculously left-leaning newspaper. So when you take a group of liberal journalists and you say, you're going to write fact checks about whatever you think is important, and you set them loose, you're going to come up with some pretty left-of-center fact checking. And one example that we found that I thought was interesting, I want to say there's 6 or 7 regular reporters that write for PolitiFact Ohio, and then several other Plain Dealer columnists that contribute on a more intermittent basis. One of the regular contributors to PolitiFact Ohio is named Tom Farron. He's a guy who's worked for the Plain Dealer for 11 or 12 years. He's been around for a while. He's a journalist, and there were 3 stories that he wrote over the course of summer of 2012. Last summer, starting in June, ending in mid-August. Over the course of less than 2 full months, he had written 3 PolitiFact Ohio columns, fact-checking statements that Josh Mandel or Mandel's Senate campaign had made. He gave all 3 of those statements pants on fire rulings, which is the worst ruling that you can get from PolitiFact Ohio. And the way that PolitiFact Ohio works, they're an affiliate of PolitiFact.com, which is a project of the newspaper down in Florida. There's a lot of research that's shown PolitiFact.com skews to the left because, again, they operate on a model of journalists just picking what they think is important and including the supporting evidence that they think is important. And then liberal editors looking at the columns those journalists write and putting the resulting fact check on a 6-point scale. So they have this little dial that goes from one side to the other. And if you're all the way to the right, there's a nice little green indicator that shows your statement is true. Then there's a yellow indicator if your statement is mostly true. It remains yellow for half true, turns orange for mostly false, red for a false claim, and then way off to the left, there's a cute little flame logo for pants on fire statements that are completely ridiculous. And the arbitrary nature of this rating system is pretty incredible when you actually sit down and look at it. Who's to say what's ridiculous? Who's to say what's false versus mostly false? How can you determine whether something is mostly true or half true? It's all completely based on the subjective reasoning of a liberal journalist, more often than not. And when I noticed the trend of these fact checks from Tom Farron and the real hatchet he seemed to be grinding against Josh Mandel, I thought it would be interesting to see if I could find him on social media. This is actually a good tie-in from a conversation just a few minutes ago. I found the Twitter account for Tom Farron, and I contacted the editor of PolitiFact Ohio, and I said, this Twitter account, @TomFarron, identifies itself as owned by a Cleveland Plain Dealer columnist. Is this the Tom Farron who writes for the Plain Dealer, who contributes fact checks to PolitiFact Ohio? I got a response within the next couple of days. Yes, Jason, thanks for your inquiry. That's Tom Farron. He works for us, but all of the things that he writes on Twitter are his own personal opinions. Completely fair. I sent some follow-up questions noting that Tom Farron's personal opinions seem to be incredibly progressive. He made comments that seemed supportive of Occupy Wall Street. He seemed really concerned about typical environmental left-wing issues. He seemed very concerned about income inequality. CEOs paid millions of dollars while the children of bag boys are starving in the streets, that kind of stuff. And so I asked, does it concern you that on his personal Twitter account, this columnist is writing things that are very liberal, and then he comes into work and he writes fact checks for PolitiFact Ohio that review the statements of conservative politicians? I never got a response to that, strangely. So I'd like to read for you just a handful of tweets, and I grabbed screenshots of these messages. Twitter basically is a social media platform where anybody can sign up for an account, and you can post what Twitter calls a tweet, which is just a really brief message. you're capped at 140 characters. So the intention is that you might post a comment about something that you just saw on television. You might post a link to a story that you read that you thought was interesting. And it's all intended to be, again, very concise because it's just 140 characters. So it's kind of a quick little stream of consciousness thing that you can use to post about whatever you're interested in. So here's some of the things that Tom Farron, a fact checker for PolitiFact Ohio, is interested in. On October 11th, 2008, Tom Farron tweeted, "McC," a reference to John McCain, amid the yahoos, has the stricken look of someone who spotted Mephistopheles on the edge of the crowd with a contract and a smirk. This was a comment referencing John McCain at a Tea Party rally amid the yahoos. On October 26th of 2008, Tom Farron, a fact checker for PolitiFact Ohio, tweeted, "Caller, quote, can I interest you in voting for Barack Obama, end quote. Me, quote, I did that 3 weeks ago, baby. Yes, we can. Have a blessed day, end quote. Smiles all around." And then the day after the 2008 election, Tom Farron tweeted simply, "Yes, we did." If you're familiar with the "Yes, we can" propaganda of the Obama campaign, "Yes, we did" was the clarion call for everyone who is excited about electing Barack Obama in 2008. Later in 2008, November 23rd, Tom Farron tweeted, "I like the idea of Bush leaving early. It's time to get the spectators off the field." On December 14th, 2008, Tom Farron tweeted, "This says it all. Go Obama. New Deal." 3 exclamation marks, followed by a link to this fringe left blog post where if you read it, it's nuts. This is the sort of stuff that MSNBC would look at and say, "I'm not really sure about that." This is a guy who, he wrote this rant about how everything in America is driven by racism and the Republican Party is controlled by these conservative, minority-hating nutballs. It is crazy conspiracy theory stuff that, according to PolitiFact Ohio fact checker Tom Farron, says it all. On October 3rd, 2009, Tom Farron tweeted, "If Obama came out in favor of sunshine, the wingnuts would oppose it. We should do it just to mess with them." There's a couple others here that are interesting. Roger Ebert, the famous movie reviewer, television critic, on Twitter, Roger Ebert is this notorious fringe left kook who he tweets, again, things that the reporters at MSNBC would kind of turn their noses up and think, that's a little bit nuts. On July 16, 2011, Tom Farron tweeted, "Was Twitter built for Roger Ebert? It could have been. He is essential, enriching, and its best raison d'etre," which is an adorable French phrase for its reason for existence. So Tom Farron is a huge fan of fringe leftist Roger Ebert. He's a big fan of President Obama. He tweets about Occupy Wall Street, about Andy Borowitz, a hateful left-wing reporter for The New Yorker. It's very obvious if you just skim the Twitter feed of this objective reporter that he leans way to the left. I reported about this in August of 2012, in the middle of the Senate race. By that time, Joe Hallett at the Columbus Dispatch had referred to PolitiFact Ohio as the Cleveland Plain Dealer's respected campaign fact checker. Respected why? PolitiFact Ohio claims that it's objective, simply by virtue of being a project of a mainstream media newspaper. All of the newspapers across the state say, "Hey, we've got this fact-checking service. If we need to see if anything is true, we'll just go to PolitiFact Ohio and we'll grab a quote from a PolitiFact Ohio ruling, and that's it. That topic is settled." That's really the mindset. If you look at the coverage, not just in the Plain Dealer, but in the Blade, in the Akron Beacon Journal, in the Cincinnati Enquirer, and in the Dayton Daily News, PolitiFact Ohio is just accepted. And I use this as an example, and I use this as my introduction because I think it's really instructive of what conservatives are up against. We have a media that the Plain Dealer is shedding readership. It fired something like a third or half of its newsroom staff within the past couple of months, I believe. They are bleeding profits every time there's a new report that comes out. It's bad news, not just for the Plain Dealer, but for the news newspapers all across the state, but they still have a couple 100,000 subscribers. And when you have half a dozen big newspapers, and every city has a newspaper whose reporters lean predominantly left, that's pretty heavy stream that we're swimming against. So I have a few more examples of PolitiFact's bias. There were specific rulings that Tom Farron wrote, a series of 3 pants on fire rulings in PolitiFact Ohio that weren't just ridiculous, but were the basis for this whole narrative that spread not just through Ohio, but across the state. The Plain Dealer wrote about this series of lies that Josh Mandel had been caught in, purely on the basis of liberal journalist Tom Farron saying that he was lying. And if you looked at the actual statements, Mandel's campaign said that Sherrod Brown gave huge bonuses to executives when he voted for the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, when he voted for the HART program, and technically speaking, Sherrod Brown didn't grab a bag of cash and carry it and hand it to an executive. Therefore, that's a ridiculous lie. And as you read PolitiFact Ohio's rulings, it's a consistent theme that there's a lot of context if something that a liberal says needs a lot of context to sound reasonable. There's very little context if there's something that a conservative says that in and of itself can be twisted into this ridiculous, untruthful statement. And that was the first of 3 rulings. There was a separate statement, Rule Pants on Fire by Tom Farron, where Mandel said the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, will likely go down as the biggest tax increase in history. That seems fairly reasonable to me when you consider that government programs only go in one direction. They don't shrink. They always are bigger than we expect them to be. They always grow over time. Tom Farron looked at projected taxes levied for Obamacare, and he compared that to projected gross domestic product for a single year for 2020 or 2021. And he compared that to the ratio of taxes to gross domestic product for several other historically large tax increases. And because it didn't stack up, based on that one very narrow metric, for that one specific year, he decided that it was a pants-on-fire lie to say that the Affordable Care Act will likely go down as the biggest tax increase in history. And then several weeks later, Mandel's campaign said that Sherrod Brown sent billions of our dollars to foreign countries, which is absolutely true. Tom Farron wrote that it was absolutely true, but he decided that Mandel was only talking about the stimulus bill. And there were specific cases where stimulus funding that was expected to go overseas. I think there was a Chinese windmill manufacturer. There may have been a couple of overseas. I think there was a Scandinavian solar panel manufacturer that was allotted stimulus funds that didn't actually receive them. And therefore, Josh Mandel is a pants-on-fire liar by saying Sherrod Brown sent billions of our tax dollars to foreign countries. After Tom Farron wrote that series of rulings, and I should know, since you're not all very familiar with PolitiFact Ohio, pants-on-fire rulings, they aren't just the far off of the scale, this is the most ridiculous lie that we rate. They're very uncommon. So when you look at the total number of pants-on-fire rulings that Mandel had received by the end of that campaign, and you stack those up against the pants-on-fire rulings that Sherrod Brown had received by the end of that campaign, Mandel has been the state treasurer since 2010. Sherrod Brown has been a U.S. senator since 2006. Sherrod Brown has received 1 pants-on-fire ruling in the 2 years from 2010, when PolitiFact Ohio started, to the end of 2012. Josh Mandel had received 6 pants-on-fire rulings from the end of 2011 through the end of 2012. So you can see at the beginning of the campaign, it was very clear, if you read through the body of their work, that PolitiFact Ohio and Cleveland Plain Dealer had it in for Josh Mandel, and they decided they were going to pick every remotely objectionable statement that he or his campaign made, and they were just going to lacerate him over it. And that's what they did. And after Tom Farron wrote that series of 3 Pants on Fire rulings in 2 months. Again, Sherrod Brown had received 1 Pants on Fire ruling in 2 years. Tom Farron turned around and wrote a news column for the Plain Dealer titled, "Campaign Claims Give Josh Mandel Pants on Fire Crown." So they crowned Josh Mandel essentially the king of liars when it comes to Ohio politics. And the column about that was written by the same guy who did the fact checks, finding that, golly, when you look at the evidence that a liberal wants to look at, this conservative politician is a really ridiculous lie. Again, this was not just published in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. This was a narrative that made it into the Columbus Dispatch, that was picked up by Mark Niquette at Bloomberg. It was picked up by Karen Kassler at NPR. Reporters across the state and the country saw what PolitiFact Ohio was doing, because all of the DC media are familiar with PolitiFact, and so all of the various arms of PolitiFact in states across the country automatically are respected by the Beltway media. And it's quite incredible when you see what just one liberal journalist was able to do by putting on his fact checker hat and saying, "I'm going to tell you whether this is true or false." So that was interesting. On a slide that, I actually like the title of this one, so I'm going to read it since you can't actually see it on the screen. PolitiFact don't need no stinking science. One of the things that I wrote about when covering PolitiFact Ohio is that there's absolutely no scientific process in what PolitiFact Ohio does. They follow the pattern that's set forth by PolitiFact.com, and PolitiFact.com just kind of does what they feel like, essentially. They decide what claims they're going to fact check by looking through emails that they get from readers and then just picking whatever sounds interesting according to the journalist that's going to do the fact check. They judge quotes, sometimes based on the exact wording of a quote, sometimes based on what they perceive to be the context of that quote, and as you can imagine, exact quotes sometimes aren't as accurate as we would like for them to be, regardless of where a politician falls on the political spectrum. But if you take a quote and you really ruthlessly judge it by its exact wording, pretty much anybody is a liar. But at the same time, they're not consistent about it. So sometimes they'll take a quote and say, well, in the context of what they were talking about, it's obvious that they didn't mean this when they said this. They meant something else, and so I'm going to judge the something else because we're about facts and not just gotchas. So there's no consistency on how they judge their claims. They add as much or as little context as the reporter feels like adding. They then put the column that was written more often than not by a left-leaning reporter in front of predominantly left-leaning editors, and those editors assign it on that 6-point scale that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. So PolitiFact Ohio is something that you don't hear a lot about when there's not a big statewide campaign going on, but during 2012 they were pretty widely quoted, and the work they did, when you take a look at it, you don't even have to hold it under a magnifying glass. You just have to give more than a passing glance to the stuff that PolitiFact Ohio writes, and it's clear that they lean to the left. But none of the reporters across the state are willing or able to acknowledge that. There's a slide here where I included a graphic I put together. I looked up the voting records on LexisNexis for the people who work for PolitiFact Ohio, all of the people that are listed on the Plain Dealer's website. If you look at the editors, both of them most recently voted as Democrats. There were 12 Democrats and 3 Republicans based on the party identification of their most recent voting records at PolitiFact Ohio. So 4-to-1, Republicans were outnumbered by Democrats. Everybody knows that Democrat doesn't necessarily mean that you are very liberal, and Republican certainly does not mean that you are very conservative. But just as kind of a very high-level, 35,000-foot view looking down, 4-to-1 Democrat to Republican doesn't suggest fair and balanced to me. Another thing that I did at the end of 2012 was look at all the claims that PolitiFact Ohio judged and broke those down by category. If you look at the true claims as judged by PolitiFact Ohio, just based on a percentage of all of the Democrat claims, and a percentage of all of the Republican claims, because they've judged, when you look at the raw numbers, a lot more Republican claims because there are a lot more Republican elected officials at the state level. But Democrats have a 5-point advantage in the true category. Democrats have a 10-point advantage in the mostly true category. Democrats have an 8-point advantage in the mostly false category. Democrats have a 2-point advantage in the false category. And in the pants on fire category, Democrats have a 4 percentage point advantage. So overall, there's a 29% tilt in favor of Democrats when you just look at the predominant positive rulings are Democrat statements, and most negative rulings go to Republicans. So that's PolitiFact Ohio. Moving on from that, this is a topic that I wanted to make sure to talk about because personally I think that it's incredibly important. I'm sure that most of you here would agree. Medicaid expansion. This was going to take all of the current Medicaid funding away from states that refuse to expand Medicaid eligibility. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not do that. So, in essence, what was going to be Medicaid expansion at gunpoint for all of the states turned into an option where states can choose to expand Medicaid eligibility to everyone up to 133% of the poverty line. So we're taking a program that traditionally was designed for pregnant mothers, for children, and for the disabled, and we're now making it just an all-out, here's a safety net for everybody who is poor below a certain level. We're going to help them by shoving them into this really ineffective, incredibly expensive national entitlement program. Everyone, I think, probably assumed, unless you have even lower expectations from the governor than I do, I think most people assume that the governor would not expand Medicaid eligibility. But as the summer kind of dragged on, there were some rumblings from his administration and the comments that he was making publicly and the things that his administration was saying that made you wonder, is he seriously considering expanding Medicaid and taking billions more in federal funding that the federal government can't pay for? February 4th came around, and everybody knows what happened on February 4th when his budget was released. Governor Kasich's Medicaid expansion, according to his office, would bring $13 billion in federal funding into the state of Ohio over the next 7 years. And there are two really disconcerting things about Medicaid expansion here in Ohio. The first one is pretty obvious, the fact that a Republican governor wants to expand Medicaid at all. So the decision itself should be really troubling for anyone who cares about the free market, for anyone even vaguely conservative. The second aspect of that, and something that is not as well known because the legacy media has no interest in talking about it, Governor Kasich has been incredibly dishonest in the way he's been selling the Medicaid expansion to the state legislature. If you look at statements that Greg Moody, his director of the Office of Health Transformation, made on February 14th before the House Budget Committee, Greg Moody said that, and actually I think I've got a screenshot of one of the slides that he used, where I had, before I buried it. Here it is. Greg Moody said that not extending Medicaid would mean not keeping $2.4 billion in Ohioans' federal tax dollars in Ohio. $13 billion over 7 years. That's federal funding. $2.4 billion is the total amount of money that the governor's administration estimates Medicaid expansion would bring into Ohio, I think in 2014, that's the estimate. $13 billion over 7 years. That $13 billion is $13 billion of additional debt. That's $13 billion of taxes from all 50 states. So by saying that we're going to keep all of Ohioans' federal tax dollars in the state of Ohio, that's simply false. It is not true. The governor is talking about keeping $13 billion that are not ours. The governor is talking about making sure that this money is not spent in other states. He has said repeatedly, he said in his State of the State address, that if we don't spend this money, other states will. If if we don't spend it here, they're going to spend it in California. That's false. It is not true. The way Medicaid expansion works is if states opt to expand Medicaid eligibility, they just get this open-ended promise of all of the newly eligible people up to 133% of the federal poverty line have 100% of their Medicaid expenses paid for by the federal government through 2017. And then in 2017, it gradually phases down to 90%. That's, again, an open-ended promise. The way the governor is selling this, he's basically telling the state legislature that there's this big pot of Medicaid expansion money, and the money is going to go to the states that stick their hands in. So by golly, if Ohio doesn't put its hand out for some of that money, then we're not going to get our fair share of federal funding to expand Medicaid, and Ohio's share of Medicaid expansion money is going to go to New York, is going to go to California, to Illinois, or any of those other blue states that are all for any federal bailout they can get their hands on. So I think that's incredibly important. I think that in your conversations with your state representatives, that is something that I would mention. That is something that I have mentioned to Representative Grossman, my state representative. It's very troubling to me that not only did the governor decide he was going to pursue the Medicaid expansion because it really looks like he just wants the Ohio Hospital Association and all of the other medical lobbying groups on his side for 2014. Not only did he do that, but he's doing it in an incredibly dishonest way. The talking points that he's using, he developed with the help of the Universal Healthcare Action Network. The Universal Healthcare Action Network, as its name would suggest, is a socialized medicine lobbying group. Plain and simple. The reason the Universal Healthcare Action Network exists is to push for additional government control over healthcare, because we need more government control over healthcare to make it fair, to make sure that everybody has equal access to treatment. Because as we all know, government subsidies guarantee equal access, and saying that someone is insured guarantees that they're going to get good health care. That's what the Universal Healthcare Action Network believes, and if you listen to the things Governor Kasich is saying about the Medicaid expansion, apparently that's what Governor Kasich and his administration believes. Yes?
Right, I just interject something on what you're speaking about. This issue 3 that we passed here in Ohio as part of the Constitution, that state officials cannot implement a social type healthcare thing. Does that have any teeth and bearing on what you're talking about right now?
The Healthcare Freedom Amendment forbids the government from mandating that anyone purchase health care. The Healthcare Freedom Amendment, unfortunately, does not prevent the government from promising additional handouts to the people.
So it has no teeth in this area.
It does not affect the Medicaid expansion. Yes.
I wanted to make a couple of comments. Actually, before I came here, I got a phone call asking me to join in the governor's town hall phone meeting tonight. So it was really interesting to hear you say exactly what you said on that call, that number one, the $13 billion would stay here, and otherwise it would go to California. He did absolutely say that. The other thing that he's talking about now is that by expanding this, we'll be able to take all those people who are addicted and homeless and mentally ill, and we'll create programs to keep them out of the jails and so on. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm not sure how you're going to do that, but yeah, sounds good.
Because free money. That's
right. But the other thing I wanted to comment on, it goes kind of back to what Dean was saying, was when I talked to Ann Gonzalez about this a couple of weeks ago, it was only a very short conversation. I didn't have an agenda other than to just hear what she had to say. And she said the same thing about keeping the money here. But the other thing that she said, which I think is even more telling, is that the hospitals, if we do not expand Medicare in the state, the hospitals will not receive reimbursements that they have been receiving from the federal government for those indigent people. So, in other words, the hospitals are the ones that are going to be hurt by this. theoretically, until the federal government steps in and provides that coverage that they promise. I'm curious about what your view of that particular part of it is in light of your comment on the Ohio Hospital Association and those hospital lobbying groups are the ones that are really pushing this.
That could have been a planted question. I should slip
It wasn't.
I should slip you $5 on the way out, because that's actually a perfect segue. I mentioned when I started speaking, there's two of us. Media Trackers Ohio covers everything that's going on across the state, so we try to be very strategic about what we cover. More often than not, Jesse covers local issues, and I do the more in-depth state-level analysis, just because that's where our interests lie, and so that's usually what works best for us. The Ohio Hospital Association is warning, and to a certain extent, they have some merit to their argument. They're warning that because of the way the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act works, they're not going to get reimbursements for providing charity care. And that's absolutely true. Obamacare was written to force more people into Medicaid, one, by promising a big pile of free federal money to all of the states that agreed to expand eligibility. And secondly, by phasing out disproportionate share hospital payments. Disproportionate share hospital payments go to hospitals that provide a large amount of charity care at cost. I put out a story, I think it was just earlier this week, analyzing a dozen of the biggest hospitals in the state, looking at the total revenue that they recorded in 2011, which is the most recent year that their IRS filings were available. And almost all of them, even without any reimbursements for providing charity care, still would have recorded positive net income in 2011 because they provide millions of dollars of charity care, which they ought to. They are nonprofits after all.
That was the other thing that I was like, aren't they nonprofits?
They're nonprofits, and so I'll send Joe or Matt a list of links to just related stories after the meeting so we can distribute it to everybody here. But I just published a story several days ago about that, looking at the actual numbers, and when you look at the numbers, the hospitals absolutely benefit from that disproportionate share hospital funding that they get for providing charity care at cost. But the narrative that the Ohio Hospital Association created, that Governor Kasich has embraced wholeheartedly, that hospitals are just going to go belly up, and it's going to be this dystopian, post-apocalyptic wasteland where nobody's going to be able to get health care because all of the hospitals are going to go bankrupt because this charity care funding that they survive on is going away. In reality, most of the charity care the hospitals provide, they already provide at cost and take a loss on because only a very small portion of it is reimbursed. I think one example that comes to mind, the Cleveland Clinic, and this is kind of cheating because the Cleveland Clinic is huge, but the Cleveland Clinic reported something like $3.5 billion in total revenue in 2011. They reported $275 million in net income, I believe. And after providing tens of millions of dollars of charity care at cost to people who don't have insurance, to the indigent, they received $440,000 some in disproportionate share hospital funding. So already they're providing a lot of care that is not being offset by the federal government. The entire argument is completely ridiculous, and I think one thing that we need to remind our legislators is that the federal government is $16.5 trillion in debt. $16.5 trillion. That's a number that I can't even begin to fathom. That is an enormous amount of money. That's not even including existing unfunded liabilities for Social Security, for Medicare, for Medicaid. You add all those things in, and we're talking upwards of $100 trillion. So the federal government doesn't have the money to pay for what it's promising. We're asking the federal government to give us a pile of money because other irresponsible states are asking the federal government to give them piles of money. It does not help to say, hello, poor person, I care about you. I'm compassionate. I'm a conservative, but I'm a compassionate conservative, which if you look at the things Governor Kasich is saying, they very strongly resemble a lot of the most disappointing things that President Bush said over the years. And the entire premise that by promising things we cannot afford to people who cannot afford them themselves, or somehow helping them, it's disgusting, frankly. And it's fine and dandy for the Universal Healthcare Action Network to say that because they're socialists, because they cannot count, because they're ideologically devoted to the government providing everything for everyone, even though that's never worked anywhere in history. But when Governor Kasich starts saying those things, there's a very real reason for us to be concerned. Yes?
He's been betrayed.
This is kind of remedial, but can you explain to me why he's saying, okay, if Ohio doesn't take it, it'll go to somebody else? And I'm not quite sure why you say that's not true. I think I kind of understand,
Okay.
but if you could give me the talking points, that would be
Absolutely. Ultimately, Obamacare promises to pay for 100% of states' Medicaid costs from 2014 to 2017. But they're only going to pay that if you expand Medicaid eligibility. There was a Kaiser Family Foundation report that was released back before the Supreme Court decision that estimated the cost of Medicaid expansion for all of the states, and they estimated it was going to run in the hundreds of billions of dollars if all of the states expanded Medicaid, as they were expected to do before the Supreme Court made it optional for states could reject it without losing their existing Medicaid funding. So essentially, if Medicaid expansion, and these numbers are not going to be accurate because every state has different populations, but if Medicaid expansion in Ohio costs the federal government $2 billion a year, it costs $2 billion in Indiana, it costs $2 billion in Michigan, it costs $2 billion in Pennsylvania, and all of those states expand Medicaid eligibility, that's a total of $8 billion that the federal government is going to be spending. If Indiana expands Medicaid, and Michigan expands Medicaid, and Pennsylvania expands Medicaid, that's a total of $6 billion that the federal government would be spending, because the money that they would otherwise be sending to Ohio, they will not be spending. So Ohio's rejection of the Medicaid expansion does not increase the pool of money that is available to the other states. Every state that expands will get all of the money that they need, however much that is, and we don't really know. It's all estimates at this point. But every state that expands Medicaid will be adding to the national debt, will be worsening the $1 trillion a year deficit spending that the federal government has already been reporting for the past 4 years. So does that make a little more sense?
Thank you.
Yes.
To the media
Yes.
and your function. The media in this country, 99% of it is liberal. What can one little operation like yours produce? You're not going to stop them from being liars. You're not going to stop them from being progressive. What do you hope to attain by what you do?
Well, ultimately, a lot of that lies on the folks in this room, the people that follow the Media Trackers Twitter account, the people that like us.
I want to be convinced. You know what's going on.
But you have friends, you have family who may not already be convinced. You have friends and family who may have never heard that 16.5 trillion number before. And even if they can't understand it, who can understand it, it's a ridiculously large number. There's always going to be a certain percentage of people on the right and on the left who are never going to be persuaded. The Universal Healthcare Action Network and the people who fund the Universal Healthcare Action Network, which by the way is mostly labor unions, those people are always going to believe that more government is the answer to every problem. Just like most of us are always going to believe that government screws things up more often than it fixes things. But in the middle, and I could pretend to guess what percentage of people on any given issue, there are always going to be people who we can convince who, even if we can't, we have to make some effort. And it's a little depressing when I take a step back and think about it, because, as you mentioned, there's a lot working against the truth when it comes to unsustainable government spending. It's just presupposed by almost all of the reliable and objective and trustworthy reporters in the state, that if the federal government promises to spend a bunch of money in Ohio, Ohio should take it because it's free money, and why not?
I think the people in this room do talk to their friends and neighbors and try to convince them. Something we're already doing.
Yes.
So we're vastly outnumbered.
Yes.
Supreme Court's going to have another judge replaced sometime in the
Next year or so.
He's got the presidency, he's got the Senate, he's got the Supreme Court. The only way you're going to overcome that is revolution. Or state qualification.
It's going to be difficult. Were you here when that mayor was at the meeting? Was it last month when that mayor was here? I know there's a lot working against us again, but the reality is any one person can only do so much as they can. There's an ugly reality staring us in the face, and we can stare back at it or we can close our eyes. It's still going to be there, but you know, we have to try and do what we can to get the word out. And what I see is my job, what I see as the purpose of Media Trackers Ohio is to ask questions that the legacy media will not ask and present the answers in an easily understandable, hopefully in an easily understandable and a compelling way, and get that research, get that information out to all of you so that you can be force multipliers and take it out to everyone that you know. To talk to the people in Westerville, in Worthington, and the other Tea Party groups around the state. Make sure that as much as possible, people are seeing the research that I'm putting out there. And that's making a fairly bold assumption that I'm doing work that is worthwhile, but I'm being paid, so somebody thinks it's worthwhile.
You see the devastation that's coming.
Yeah.
Not do more than just talking about it. You're going to have to prepare for that devastation. Your effort's going to have to be expanded a bit. Besides educating us, how do you prepare for what's coming?
These guys are tools for us. You know,
That's hurtful.
No, I tell you, they have a video posted, and we're running out of time. I don't know if he's going to be able to talk about it. They have a video posted on their website right now of the Strongsville teachers who are currently on strike. When I describe this video, you're not going to believe it. It's literally a crowd of teachers in the teachers union lined up outside of a police station where the substitute teachers are going to apply for a job. And the potential substitute teachers are walking through a gauntlet, a literal gauntlet of teachers and union members verbally harassing them, calling them scabs and
get an honest
job.
Go home, you don't belong.
They literally have to have a police escort take them in. These people are screaming at them. The last lady who goes in, she's an African-American lady, she's accompanied by a police officer. She's getting the harassment all the way down the gauntlet she walks. The last person, before she walks into the door, says, "Rosa Parks would be ashamed." The police officer had finally had enough. He turned around and he said, "She's here on police business. She wasn't even applying for a job. She was just some lady that the police officers were taking in, and they were harassing everybody." Now, these are stories that we don't see, obviously, the media cover. But I showed the video to a couple co-workers who are by no means conservative. They said, "This is disgusting." Now, they're a tool that we need to use to get real stories out there. The more people we tell, the more the word gets out there, and the more successful these guys are going to be. So, and I'll turn it back over to him.
You have no idea how many people put a PolitiFact on Facebook to get their facts.
Yes.
Right? And you're like, it doesn't even make sense.
Right. Mm-hmm. And credit where it's due. That video of the Strongsville teachers forming a human gauntlet and screaming at everybody that passes by because they assume that they are applying for substitute teaching jobs, that was actually put together by Corey Schaefer, a guy who reports for Sun News, which is owned by the Plain Dealer. So I know that I paint in broad strokes because it's easier to explain things when you generalize. And maybe I shouldn't do that, because there are honest reporters who do make a serious effort to be objective and do good work that isn't constantly tilted to the left by their personal opinions. Everybody's human. We all have opinions that are going to color the things that we think are important and the things that we think are less important. The difference between media trackers and the Dispatch, for instance, is that right at the top of the page, we tell you that we're conservative. And Joe Hallett doesn't tell you that he's liberal. So, yes.
You just answered my question. I just want to know where Dispatch fell in perspective. In your opinion.
I think relative to the other newspapers in the state, I would say that the Dispatch is the most conservative. I would say the Dispatch, especially the editorial board of the Dispatch, leans Republican. They absolutely do not lean conservative.
No.
And if you look at the coverage that they put out of the Medicaid expansion issue, especially, Joe Hallett had a story last Sunday that twice referred to the Ohio Liberty Coalition as a fringe group, referred to the Ohio Liberty Coalition as rigid ideologues, because they're standing against Governor Kasich's humane decision to expand Medicaid eligibility to the poor in the state. So some of them are better than others, and again, Corey Schaefer is doing a great job from the Sun News up in Cleveland covering the Strongsville teachers strike. There are good mainstream media reporters, it's just they are the minority. Yes?
On the Medicaid expansion, where does the state legislature fall? Has the governor thrown them overboard, or, you know?
Basically, the governor is, in my opinion, the governor is dishonestly pressuring the state legislature into feeling that they have to expand Medicaid. First, because if they don't, there's going to be hospital bankruptcies across the state. And second, because if they don't, the money that would come to Ohio is going to go to other states. Both of those things are false.
And you said you just wrote about this?
I wrote about this just a few days ago. And I'm actually working on a longer story where I'm going to put together a table, and for every member of the Ohio Hospital Association whose IRS documentation I can find, I'm just going to list a table of hospital name, total revenue in 2011, net income as a percentage of revenue, charity care offsets as a percentage of revenue. So you can see that in almost every case, their net income is greater than the amount of charity care offsets they're currently receiving. Yes.
I think in answer to the thing that the question that Tim asked, I started this one-woman campaign a few months ago that I'm not forwarding any emails that are sent to me unless I go and research and see if they're true. You're going to make it easier for me to know what's true and what's not true, and to not forward those emails. My one-woman campaign was do not forward those emails unless you know that they're true.
So, two-woman campaign, because I don't send them.
Okay, good. 2 women. We're on it.
Yes.
Well, you have long odds, but O'Reilly was talking to one of the students, I think of political science, up at Harvard. And they said that 23 out of 23 professors at the Harvard political science group were Democrats. They had 0 Republicans. Now, if you're trying to get a balanced approach, you can't have it. And I think if you look at Ohio State, if you look at most college campuses today, when I was on campus, different story, but today it's very, very much skewed in that direction. Maybe not 23 to 0, but it's highly in the opposite direction of what you and I are.
And I went to Miami. Miami is pretty conservative as far as universities go, but that's kind of damning with faint praise, really. I just have a few minutes left, so I want to touch on something that most of the comments that I was going to make about We Are Ohio and workplace freedom were accompanied by visuals, so actually it kind of works to skip those things anyway, but I just want to make sure to mention the Ohio Education Association is the largest donor to We Are Ohio. If you did not know that We Are Ohio is a union front group, We Are Ohio is a union front. They received almost 96% of their funding from labor unions in 2011 and 2012. They received $20 million from unions outside of the state. The National Education Association and the AFSCME combined for 40-some% of all of their funding when you look at the state and the national affiliates of those two public employee unions. The Ohio Education Association, and this is something that I'll be reporting on more in the future, especially when the Medicaid expansion issue has been resolved one way or another. The average pay of employees of the Ohio Education Association, would anybody care to guess what the average teachers union employee is paid? The employees of the union. The people who are paid, with the forced dues taken from the top.
125 a year.
80,000.
It's just over $100,000 on average. It's just over $100,000. The president of the Ohio Education Association in their fiscal year 2012, which ended in like last June, she was paid $267,000. So I think that among the elected officials in the state, everybody's terrified of workplace freedom because of what happened in Senate Bill 5, because unions have a pile of forced dues that they can throw around anytime anyone challenges them. No matter how modest, no matter how obvious and reasonable the reforms are, there's always going to be a huge pot of union cash thrown against it. But there are some facts that really, if people just knew them, would be, I think, would have a staggering impact on the Workplace Freedom Campaign in particular. So if you haven't read up on Ohioans for Workplace Freedom, that's a really big issue that I think everybody should get involved in as much as possible. And I'm just going to close by reading a couple of paragraphs from a recent story that Joe alluded to. In January, Jesse was working on a story about the Upper Arlington City School District. He wrote a story about the president of the Upper Arlington School Board basically pulling a couple of quotes from an email that this guy had sent from his Ohio State University account. He's a psychology professor at the Ohio State University, and he's also a school board member in Upper Arlington. He had written some pretty hateful things about conservatives, made reference to this retrograde Neanderthal Tea Party no tax stuff, commenting about Educate UA, the campaign against the tax levy in Upper Arlington in 2012. And we gave him a hard time about that because he's a public official. He made these comments in public record. We received these public records as a result of an open records request. So we had every right to publish this stuff. He warned us not to, and he got really angry when we did. So I wrote a story last week about the fact that he was harassing Jesse, demanding that we delete this story on Media Trackers. He couldn't identify anything in it that was wrong, but it was a hateful attack, and it was just reprehensible what we've done. So I wrote to his peers on the school board, and I wrote to the publicly listed email address for the school board president, not the school board president, because that's the guy in question, but the superintendent, and I asked him, what do you think about this? Here's a comment that the school board president made on my reporter's personal Facebook page. Seems pretty childish. Do you have any thoughts? Instead of responding, they sent my email to Dr. Robert Arkin, the president of the Upper Arlington City School Board. And he responded with this 880-word screed about how awful I was and the terrible things that media stalkers had done to him, because it's mature to call people silly names. The last two paragraphs of that email, I'm going to read those quickly in my Micro Machines guy voice. If anybody remembers the old Micro Machines commercials from when I was a kid, you talk very quickly if nobody remembers those commercials. Now, to the article Jesse wrote about me, and which you as editor seemingly approved. It is deplorable. It isn't news, it is character assassination. There is no single thing in your attack that is relevant to my work with the schools. To wit, by analogy, I drank 2 huge mugs of coffee late this morning and urinated twice while watching the DVR replay of Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace. That isn't news either. The thing you guys wrote about me doesn't even begin to reach the low standards that you set with your other articles. Now, pull down the ridiculous article, grow up some. I'm 29, he's in his 60s, he's a college professor. He's telling me grows. Now pull down the ridiculous article, grow up some, and I'll go away. You won't hear from me again. On the other hand, leave it up if you like. I am in my 60s, I have a terminal disorder, and I feel I have nothing to lose. I will defend myself in every way possible. My next step is to ask my attorney to look closely at your 501c3 status. As to me, you appear to be political operatives rather than journalists, and I don't think, though I have something to learn here indeed about that law, that is permissible. I will not be intimidated by your snarky email to my colleagues either, or to anyone else. What you did to me was entirely reprehensible. The only way to redeem any character at all is for you to pull it down and pronto. If you do not, then I hope you enjoy this repartee. I responded to Dr. Arkin by saying, I encourage you to speak with your attorney about the story that we posted, as no part of it was inaccurate. We quoted accurately from a public record sent by a public official to other public officials, denigrating public taxpayers who happen to oppose a tax hike. I'm sure that a legal professional can inform you that is well within the purpose of a non-profit 501c. So he's asked over and over again to see our IRS documentation. I haven't gotten that from my bosses yet, but I'm going to send it to him as soon as I do. It's probably going to be from 2011 before Media Trackers was even founded. So I hope he has a good time digging through it and trying to find some evil conservative donor that gave to American Majority before Media Trackers Ohio was created. But just another example of what we're up against. This guy is a school board official. The Columbus Dispatch hasn't written about it. I've pestered several of their reporters for a week about this story. This guy is having a meltdown. In response to the story where I quoted those last two paragraphs from Dr. Arkin, he posted 8 comments before anyone else had ever said a word. He's posted 17 or 18 comments on that story, and they don't get more rational as he goes on. He's coming completely unwound on a public website in response to a public record being quoted. The Columbus Dispatch doesn't care. NPR State Impact Ohio exists to talk about education news. They don't care. So, to what you said, we're up against a line. I'm going to do what I can.